Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. Well, you see there's a pool noodle behind me. And at about 10 seconds into the video, you're probably wondering, Outlaw, why is this pool noodle not cut? Well, there's actually a reason for that. The reason being, on why this pool noodle isn't cut, is because we're actually going to do kind of a throwback review. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, Outlaw, what the hell are you talking about, throwback review? Well, if you remember, a few years ago I did the unboxing and review of this, the Cold Steel Italian longsword. And I made a video of this, but I didn't post it because, well, I deleted it. Partially on accident, partially because I just hated the cutting footage of this thing. Now, Outlaw Knight loves this longsword, and he's able to make it work, but for me, for the life of me, I've never been able to really cut with this. I've gotten a couple of cuts, but I've just never been able to make this thing work for me. It is the only sword that I have never been able to really get what I consider to be decent cuts with. And it's partially due to blade geometry, and also probably has something to do with the fact that I have no idea how to actually use this sword in the same proper techniques that it was originally created to be used with. But we're going to be doing a throwback review. Now, why am I doing this? Well, Gargoyle has recently been doing these videos of him going back with his old swords after a while, and I realized that once I do the initial unboxing, review, and cutting videos for these swords, honestly, I don't ever think I did a cutting video for this. Well, I think I did a cutting video / Halloween special for this, or something like that. But I realized I never actually go back and talk about the swords after the fact. So this is the Cold Steel Italian Longsword Man-at-Arms edition. It's the Man-at-Arms edition because it's solid black. Black grip, black pommel, black grip, black guard, black blade, black pommel, black, blackety, black, blackjack, as Matthew Jensen would say. This sword, in its very design, lends itself well to thrusting techniques and even half swording. It's not so much a cutting geometry. But let's see if we can't actually get a cut on this. Now this thing will basically, the only thing I've ever been able to cut is those really, really thin plastic bottles, like the ice mountains and such. But I'm wondering if I can do it with the pool noodle. Now, you generally want to cut at the center of percussion, which is roughly here, and that's where the blade really starts to taper to a fine point. I don't know exactly the typology of this longsword, to be honest. I haven't really studied oakshot or European typologies much. But I do know one thing, that this is a thrust-oriented blade. And it does superiorly well on thrusts and hard targets that the blade really has no choice but to bite into. I don't have any specs on me at this time, I'll look up the specs and I'll like splice the specs in at the end of the video. But without further ado, don'ts and probably shouldn'ts, let's get started. I'm going to attempt to do a cut from Wrathguard. And Wrath is such like this. And see how well that works. If it doesn't work well, I'll switch over to finger over the guard grip. Now, this section of the blade is blunt from my finger down to the guard, so I'm not concerned with cutting myself. If you look, most historical swords that you'll find in a museum don't actually start to have a sharp edge until the latter half of the blade. Because up here is where you're going to be doing your cutting with really any sword. And down here really doesn't need to be sharp, because it's for blocking and parrying. So let's see how well Wrathguard cuts. I'm going to be honest with you, if I actually cut this pool noodle, I'm going to be quite surprised. Okay. I did not expect that to happen. That I expected to happen. That I expected to happen. Even something like that. Now, I believe that when I was striking, I was actually striking much lower down here on the blade where it's wider than up here where it's narrower, because up here it's pretty much blunt. Down here it has a relatively good edge. So let me just test that theory. I'm going to cut right here. Well, my theory is uncontested. Ah, I see. Here's the center of percussion. Right here. This is the sweet spot for cutting with this sword. Between where my finger is, where my thumb is, and here. I'd even argue that you could probably get away with extending the sweet spot of the cold steel Italian longsword up to about here to here. Well, it's definitely not conclusive enough to do upper slashes and such. But at least now we know that it was my fault all this time for not realizing where the sweet spot on this sword lies. But for it to be a truly conclusive kind of revisit, we'll have to cut the quote-unquote bane of this sword's cutting career, which is water bottles. So I'm going to pause the video while we go back into the outlaw shrine, as it was. because the secret garden, which is this area right here, a little noisy in the middle of the day. So we shall be right back. Now the camera is setting far back because I have to cut relatively low on this, and there's a high chance of it sending bottles everywhere, so I want my camera in a safe place. Check to see if the now you may have noticed that I brought out the old Warrior O katana as well. And zoom out for a minute. That's because I want to do two cuts. A controlled cut that I know will work with the Warrior O versus the underlying variable that is the longsword. I know that the Warrior O will go through any of the bottles I put it up against. But the longsword is a different story. Since I have just recently found out where its sweet spot lies, I want to kind of toy around a little bit. Put the longsword over here for a moment. Now to make this test fair and comparable, I'm going to be using bottles that even the Warrior O has proven to have difficulties with in the past, and these are these prime energy drink bottles. This isn't going to be highly scientific or anything of that nature, but I am trying to get the best results possible. First, the control test with the Warrior O. Three, two, one. As we saw, the Warrior O sent the bottle flying. But with relative ease, it did cut it. I might have to actually go back in and resharpen the blade of the Warrior O, because my stropping, the honing belt I've been using to keep this thing sharp, is kind of worn out. But I do believe that the edges are comparable. Now we'll move on to the longsword. Again, here is the sweet spot. I'm going to be cutting from here downwards. So I'm going to be relatively close to this bottle. 3, 2, 1. Well, something clearly happened here. For admittedly, I shut my eyes halfway through it. So I guess we'll see it on camera. I have one more prime bottle that we can use for test. And I know I only did one cut with the Warrior O, but then again, the Warrior O is there for just the comparison. The true thing we are testing is the cutting ability of the longsword. Huh. So even though I have to stand ridiculously close, I can cut it. Now, some of you may be wondering, Outlaw, if you have to stand that close to cut something, then shouldn't you just, at that point, not even bother with the long sword, just get yourself a short sword or a dagger? And you would be right. If I have to stand so ridiculously close to cut something, that would be a bad thing. But here's another thing that we need to consider about this type of sword. Sorry, I don't have my suspenders on. That being the fact that this sword, by its very blade shape, is not conclusive to being a strong cutter. Its true performance comes in when we consider that this sword was from the early, this sword design in general was from the early 14th century to roughly mid 15th to late 16th centuries. That's the Renaissance era. And that is an era where there were many more knights, man-at-arms, and common soldiers in general that had access to not only the chainmail and gambeson used prior to the Renaissance, but also full-plate armor became generally more available to the common soldier. So you had more than just the nobility and knights in full-plate armor. You had men-at-arms, which were rallied soldiers, which were fighters and warriors and rallied soldiers hired by lords to supplement their fighting forces. You had mercenaries. You had farm boys being drafted and basically given a spear, a helmet, and some chainmail. And even some maybe gauntlets and full plate armor to go along with it if they prove themselves. But in any case, in the 16th century, from the 13th to 16th century, plate armor became more widely used and available, generally speaking. So sword makers were like, well, obviously our swords can't cut through steel armor. And obviously the old style of having a cut and thrust combination blade was working, but what happens when you go up against plate armor that you can't cut? The simplest solution was to make the blades narrower and pointier so that in turn they could stab in between the plates of armor where there would be natural gaps where there are joints. Stabbing into the armpit for one. Stabbing into your elbow joints for another, behind the knees, into the groin. Right? These places were targets that you needed a nimble sword with plenty of point control to get into. And when you think about this, even when I'm doing just these half-ass thrusts, the point of this sword is going exactly where I'm thrusting at. So it does have tremendous tip and point control. However, because of its thrusting capability and its point control and its tip control, its cutting performance was gradually diminished as compensation for that thrusting ability. This will get in between the plates, in between plate armor and chainmail, far more effectively than this Okatana blade will. Now, if you're fighting against an opponent that doesn't have chainmail and doesn't have gambeson, the Okatana will definitely cut through the gambeson far more effectively than the longsword. And I know this is sort of becoming longsword versus katana, and I'm not meaning for this to happen, but we are comparing just these two swords. We are looking back on this one, but I need to add context here. That this blade shape was developed to fight against armor. This blade shape was developed to fight against mostly unarmored to heavily light. Well, I don't mean heavily armored. I mean heavily lightly armored, and that means the majority of troops that this sword fought were lightly armored, mostly wearing layers upon layers of cloth, and maybe like wood, because there is historical wooden samurai armor, laminated armor, where there's little steel plates sewn to a leather where there's little metal plates sewn to a larger plate of leather that this sword could get in between the little metal plates, stab through the leather and into somebody. But yes, if I was going to be fighting against somebody, yeah, and that again is where this Italian version of the longsword comes into play. Now that I have found out that because it's not a bad cutter because of its blade, generally, it does still possess the ability to cut. It's bad because I haven't understood that. Most of my sword swinging background, this was the third sword I ever bought. I had owned two katana up until that point, the crane and the orchid katana. And I had tremendous cutting ability, tremendous ability to cut with the katana. And I thought that, oh, this longsword is going to be the same way. I was looking for a longsword. $200 seemed cheap in comparison to a lot of other shit that I had been looking at the time. So I was like, cool, great. And then I was like, I tried cutting with this thing, and I tried cutting with this thing. And it really only worked against thick tree branches for the longest time. Then Outlaw Knight was able to cut with this thing, and I was like, okay, there is something I'm doing wrong here. Then I started to really deep dive into longsword, and I kind of set the whole like learning longsword thing to the side for a while because I kept looking at other swords and I kept finding more information about swords. Then I bought my first Dao, and then I bought a Kriegsmesser and a Viking sword, and all the way down the road. And the Viking sword is really what reignited my interest in the whole double-edged sword thing. Because personally, I don't really like double-edged swords because they're not silhouettely appealing to me. Alright? I find that single-edged swords just have more advantages in combat, especially if you have to push off with your opposite hand before you can, like, institute a grapple. I would not want to just casually bash my hand into a double-edged sword blade. Hence why I prefer single blade. But in any case, now that I have given this sword a full, honest chance, I must say that for its blade, for the shape of the blade itself, it's not that bad. But my own lack of experience and, I want to say, ignorance has kind of made me have a bad view of this sword, in my opinion. And for that, I am sorry to the sword. But now that I've figured out what I've been doing wrong in cutting with this thing, because what I've been doing wrong is I've been trying to cut with this upper half like you do with a katana, and that's wrong. This particular blade geometry bodes well for cutting lower on the blade where it's wider. This narrow tip is very much a thrust-oriented formation. So with that in mind... Hello, my noble outlaws. This is kind of future outlaw after making the throwback review for the longsword with specifications. I told you I was going to put this at the end of the video, but I thought since my phone decided it wanted to be an asshole and split the video into two parts, I'll put it right in the middle of the two parts. So according to the description, and the camera lens is over here, I'm looking directly at my face, so that's why my eyes are looking that way. But according to the description on Cult of Athena, I bought the sword on Amazon, but Cult of Athena uses the same factory specifications as Cold Steel. Longswords took precedence over single-handed swords on the battlefield in the later part of the medieval era and Renaissance. Those single-hand swords were still popular for cavalry and for personal defense. Armor had advanced to the point that warriors could confidently dispose of their shields and focus on offense, reach, and power. Now well-armored warriors can have both hands free for a fast, strong weapon. The elongated handle allows for more leverage than a single-handed sword, and it was common to grip the blade with gauntlets to control the tip and thrust the sword into weak points in the armor. Fighting manuals of the time even show techniques whereby the sword is gripped by the blade and the crossguard and pommel used as a weapon. Many, such as this example, had the elaborate quillons for protection and entrapment and elongated pommels that were both an extension to the grip as well as a counterbalance. This Cold Steel Italian longsword is from their man-at-arms collection. The sharp 1055 carbon steel blade is blued for a dark protective finish, and the hilt of steel is blued to match. The grip wrapped in black leather, and the blade tang is screwed into place with a pommel nut. Comes with a black leather scabbard with a blackened metal chape and throat. The specifications for the sword: overall length is 47 and 1/4 inches or 47 1/4 inches. Blade length is 35 3/4 of an inch. Weight is 3 pounds 5 ounces. Edge sharp. Width 42.9 millimeters at the base. Thickness 5.5 millimeters to 3.9 millimeters. Pommel nut. Point of balance is 4 inches from the grip. Grip length is 9 inches. Blade steel is 1055 high carbon steel. Type is longsword. Class battle ready. Manufacturer Cold Steel. Country of origin India. Thank you. And if you're wondering what this is, I cut myself shaving. I'm out. Peace. Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Future outlaw here. Well, future somewhat outlaw here. In any case, now we will be comparing and contrasting the factory specifications of the Cold Steel Italian longsword to my own measurements that I will be doing live in this segment. Now, we will be able to compare and contrast pretty much everything except for the weight, because I don't have a scale. I've been meaning to get one, but then I'm like, do I really need to buy this? And it's the whole thing, but I digress. The first thing we shall check is the claimed overall length of the sword being 47 and 1/4 inches. And the sword length is indeed 47 and 1/4 inches, with a blade length consisting of 35 and 3/4 of an inch. And I will be measuring to the base of the cross guard. And it is 35 and 3/4 of an inch. Now you're probably wondering why I didn't measure to here, the central ridge of the cross guard. And that's simply because the blade stops here, not here. Kind of similar to how some people will get the blade measurements wrong on a katana. You need to measure where the blade stops. And the blade does not continue inside the habaki. It stops on that shoulder. Next, with a grip length of 9 inches. And the grip length, not including the pommel on this sword, is actually an entire 1/2 inch short at 8.5 inches. The grip length, including the pommel, is a full solid 11 inches. We shall now measure the width of the cross guard. The cross guard from side to side, this bloody fucking tape measure, is 9 inches even. Well, 9 inches, 9 isn't even, but it's 9 inches even in the terms of there's no 1/2 inch increments. With 4.5 inches on either side from the central ridge of the cross guard. The central ridge of the cross guard is a solid 1 inch. Each of the ends of the cross guard is 3/4 of an inch wide. And the central belly of the cross guard's quillons are 3/8 of an inch. So this section right here is 3/8 of an inch. Now, the thickest portion of this cross guard, which is right here where the blade is 0.78 inches. I will be switching over to the inferior millimeters, because they're not American units, for comparison, and that is 19.8 millimeters. But we are American here, so we need to go back to inches. The middle of the cross guard sits at 0.22 of an inch. And this is true on both sides. And the very end of the cross guard capers out to both being 0.20 of an inch. Now, we shall move down to the grip. The widest area on the grip is 1.45 inches. The narrowest section, the middle section of the grip, just underneath the second riser, so right under here, is 1.27 of an inch. Right before we get to where the pommel begins is 0.92 of an inch. the narrowest section of the pommel actually flares out 0.2 inches more, or 0.02 inches more than where the base is, thus proving there's a slight lip where the pommel meets the grip. The widest section of this pommel is 1.90 inches. The total length of the pommel is 2.43 inches. And the thickness of the pommel is 1 inch even. All in all, very accurate measurements we are taking. Again, aside from the weight. Now, the width of the blade at the base of the crossguard is supposed to be 42.9 millimeters. And this one is a little wider at 44.5 millimeters, which transfers over to 1 3/4 of an inch, or 1.75 inches. The thickness at the base of the blade is supposed to be 5 millimeters. So at 0.23 millimeter, 0.23 inches, we have 5.9 millimeters, which is 0.4 millimeters thicker than what they claim the sword should be. As normal, we'll go halfway up the blade. And it is still 23.23 inches, or 5.9 millimeters. 3/4 up the blade, it tapers to 0.21 inches. And it's supposed to be 3.9 millimeters near the tip. This transfers over to millimeters as 5.4. And now here at the very tip of the blade, we have 0.17 inches, or 4.3 millimeters. And now, apparently, we must change location, my noble band of outlaws, because I'm getting tired of stabbing the ceiling. Now, as we can see, the measurements that Cold of Athena have provided are within completely tolerable standards, I should say. They're not too far off from what they have claimed. The length of this sword is what they have claimed it to be. The tapering of the sword is slightly thicker than what they claimed it to be. And really, the only thing that I can't honestly compare at the moment is the weight. Because at 3.5 pounds, well, not 3.5 pounds, 3 pounds 5 ounces, I want to say this does not feel like a 3-pound sword. Now, that is obviously personal opinion. Considering that I usually swing swords this size around one-handed to begin with, most of the time. What I would consider a heavy sword and what others would consider a heavy sword have to be taken with a grain of salt. But yes, I will have to say that the grip being that almost inch shorter than what it should be, listed at 9 inches. Cult of Athena, or I shouldn't say, I can't really blame Cult of Athena. They're going off of what factory spec is. It's obvious. It's actually to be to blame on Cold Steel for that missing inch. And I think if that missing half an inch was present, it would affect the overall handling of the sword. Now, there is another thing that we should test. The point of balance is supposed to be 4 inches off the crossguard. And I'm not measuring from this point. I'm measuring from the actual base of the blade where the blade and crossguard meet. Right here left my tape measure in the other room. Is it good for measuring thicknesses, but not so good for measuring distances? Alright. There's another side to these things. Alright. So, it is roughly 4.38 inches from the cross guard, now that I figured out how to measure with that thing. So, this longsword does meet some of these specs and criteria, just not exactly to spec. And as we saw, we did some extra measurements. We measured the thickness and length of the crossguard, which, by the way, this 9-inch crossguard is one that I personally very much like. I like the shorter crossguards and the ones that are swept up. It's not only aesthetically pleasing, but I also find it easier to maneuver this sword in the way that I am accustomed to moving these things. But with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this little added-in segment. This is going to be a very, very long video. Almost a movie. So, with that in mind, I'll let you enjoy the latter half of the video and take it back to Past Outlaw. Take it away, Past Outlaw. Few conclusive thoughts on this sword is that for the blade shape, I find it to be an acceptable cutter. It is very much a thrust-oriented blade, and that should not be underestimated. Also, I do want to do just a couple more cuts with this in comparison to the Warrior O katana, because even though these two swords are completely different in terms of blade shape, blade mass, blade thickness, and everything, the data we can conceive from a sword that's meant to cut versus a sword that's not meant to cut is a good comparison. And when you compare longsword and katana, you really can't compare the overall standard longsword. Because unlike katana that have a standard set back in the Edo period, longswords varied all over the place. There were more cut-oriented longswords, there were more thrust-oriented, like this one. There were cut and thrust longswords. But if we compare a longsword blade that is not meant to cut, at least not cut well, versus a blade shape that is meant to cut well, that's what we can kind of gauge our data on. And extrapolate, if I can form the right words here, I'm just going to say extrapolate our data. So I have a couple more bottles that are the same to each other to keep our tests fair in my bin. I'm running low because my sponsor for bottles unexpectedly cannot supply me anymore due to reasons that I am not going to disclose for personal matters. Dr. Pecker, or Dr. Pepper, whichever you prefer. This time we're going to change the order up and use the longsword first, then the katana. And I know this is turning into a very long video, but bear with me, if you would. Right. Remember, I'm cutting from here up. 2. I'm going to try putting my thumb, my finger over the guard to see if that gives me any more control. 1. Well, I did feel more control with the ring, with my finger over the crossguard. We can see it's not the cleanest cut in the world. It does swoop a bit. But it did still cut, and that's the important thing here. Now, as soon as I pull my pants up, I really need to get a cameraman. And if you live near Greene County, Indiana, and you want to be a cameraman for me, let me know in the comments. My only criteria is that I have to know who you are in IRL. Next, the Dr. Pepper. And I noticed something, that I was cutting near the tip. I'm going to cut more towards the belly of the Warrior O and see if that makes any substantial difference. 3, 2, 1. Alright. armored sweatpants. Don't worry, I'm holding the grip under my elbow. Right, as we can see, the Warrior Oil Katana produced a much smoother, cleaner cut. And that is solely because of the fact that the katana, by its very nature, is a cut and thrust sword. I know that a lot of people think that the katana can't thrust, or that it's bad at thrusting, or that the Japanese didn't use thrusting techniques. They did. It's just that to thrust with a katana, you either have to thrust upwards or flip the blade over to thrust forward effectively. And because of the blade shape of the katana in general, these were more cut and slash oriented swords. But don't let anyone tell you that the katana did not have thrusting techniques. They were just not as widely used as the slashing counterparts. So in conclusion, I know this has turned into like a 30+ minute video, but I feel as if these throwback reviews need a lot more context than my regular videos. So, with that in mind, the cold steel Italian longsword, which has been the bane of my sword cutting practice for the longest time, I have finally received my most holy of redemption. And as Tempest says, master every blade, and because of my inability to realize my mistakes, when first using this sword, I kind of said, I'm going to backburner you and focus on swords that are designed to cut better. But upon this re-examination, I would like to formally say that the cold steel Italian longsword is generally an okay cutter if you know how to kind of cut with it. Right? This isn't something that you'd give a beginner in longsword to cut with. Not by a long shot. There are much more cut-oriented swords that fulfill that role of training a newbie better than this one. But if you're teaching somebody half-swording and thrusting techniques, then I can honestly recommend this as a beginner sword because it's not very expensive to buy. It won't completely wreck your bank account to buy this sword for its $200-ish price tag. Of course, that was back in 2021 when I bought this. A little bit of a spoiler ahead. I actually have bought a second cold steel longsword. I guess I should have stopped there, but I won't tell you what cold steel longsword I bought, but I did buy a second one. And more than likely by the time I post this video, I'll have already gotten that second sword, did the unboxing, did the test cutting, and done the review. So, honestly, I feel this sword is more of an intermediate to advanced cutter kind of sword, where you kind of know how to... There's a squirrel in my tree. Is that a robin? It's either a squirrel or a robin. But it's more of an advanced cutter's blade. Not really something you'd give to a beginner. there's one more little niche that I think this sword would serve well in. And that's actually as a sparring implement. Now, before you say anything, Outlaw Samurai, you don't spar with sharp blades. Well, you can, it's just not recommended, and you usually have to wear a shit ton of safety equipment. But that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you were to take a file and completely blunt both of these edges, and you were looking for a longsword to spar with, but you can't afford a actual steel sparring sword, this would be a very good sparring blade to use because it is fairly light and nimble. However, I would be cautious of you of the thrust because this thing's a stiff as hell blade. It's almost impossible to bend this thing. I'd have to put this in a vise or sink it into a log just to bend it. But that has been my kind of throwback review of the cold steel Italian longsword. I want to title this video Throwback Review Italian Longsword. And Gargoyle Blades gave me the idea from watching his last few videos about going back and revisiting old swords of his. So thank you, Gargoyle, for giving me this idea for this half an hour long video. Almost 40 minutes. Which, honestly, if I was to do the amount of talking which I normally would do, 90% of my videos would be this long. But I wanted to give the most accurate data I could. So, until next time, my noble band of outlaws, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all be crazy rednecks, be safe when using your weapons, and look forward to my live stream tonight. Well, by the time I upload this video, I've already done the live stream. But look forward to Outlaw Samurai show every Monday from 8:30 to roughly 11 o'clock midnight sometimes. Anyways, I'm out. Oh wait, I almost forgot to tell you that the Man-at-Arms version doesn't only just come with this black on black color pattern, but you also just get basically a plain leather sheath with a couple of metal fittings. This fitting I made myself out of an old belt and some string. It's a sword frog. But yeah, the regular version of this sword actually has a wood cord scabbard. Well, just giving that little bit of information out. Okay, so this time, for real, until next time, my noble band of outlaws, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all, be crazy rednecks, be safe and use your weapons. I'm out. Peace.